again. Welcome to the Salina Board of Zoning Appeals meeting of August 15th, 2019. It appears that we have the full board in attendance and our future youth member showing enthusiasm and being here to observe how things go a month early. It's a long agenda, so we want to jump right into approval of the minutes. Have we read the minutes and have a motion?
I move we approve the minutes as shown.
Okay. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
We have a motion and second to approve the minutes as published. All in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Somebody adjust the sound level. Thank you very much. New business. We have 3 public hearings today. The first one is application number V19-4 filed by Roger Bachta, requesting a variance to allow excavation, filling, and grading of a development site located in a floodway overlay district, the Mulberry Creek floodway. That property that is the subject of this application is an unplatted 6.31 acre tract located at the west end of Coachlight Lane, east of North 9th Street and south of I-70, addressed as 635 Coachlight Lane, and I'm thankful we don't have to read the legal description on this one.
Excuse me, Chair, before we proceed, could we have who the second was? We kind of missed it with the sound there. David, thank you.
Second now.
Okay, so are we ready for the staff report, please?
We are, Mr. Chairman. You are acting as a Board of Zoning Appeals in this case, but you're acting in a little different capacity and a little more sensitive capacity because we're talking about floodplain regulations. In particular, we're talking about the floodway. And just for the benefit of the board members, it's a way sometimes difficult to distinguish between when we say floodway and floodplain. But in Salina, our floodplains are areas where you usually have backed up or standing water. There's usually not moving water involved, but areas don't drain well and water backs up and stands and creates standing flooding. The floodway is usually associated with a stream, and the floodway is the area that the stream needs to carry its conveyance downstream. So it's an area that should generally be kept free of obstruction to allow floodwaters to move downstream. And so if we start taking our floodways and fill them with obstructions or levees or fill or numerous buildings, that's going to affect the flow of water and potentially the height of floodwaters. So this is on the screen is the definition of a floodway, and it must be designed to carry the water of a base flood, meaning a 100-year flood, without increasing the water surface elevation more than 1 foot. And then in order to do any type of filling, new construction, anything in a floodway, it's generally prohibited unless the property owner has had information provided by a licensed professional engineer demonstrating that what the activity is will not result in an increase in flood levels within the city during the occurrence of the base flood discharge. So the 2 things you should focus on here, and you'll be thinking along those lines anyway. 1, whether it's a good idea to do development in a floodway area, but your specific task is to determine whether you are convinced that the excavating, filling, and grading being proposed by the applicant will not increase flood levels on Mulberry Creek. And so to that end, there is a fairly lengthy flood impact study that's attached to your packets, but I'm going to set the background for this area. The applicant on this particular case is Mr. Roger Bachta, and he has a contract to purchase this property. He has retained the services of the engineer who did the floodplain study and analysis for the entire city of Salina. He also did the floodplain analysis for the hotel project that's directly to the east of this site. If we could get some geographic reference here while we discuss this, John, that would be helpful, whether it's the aerial photo or something, just so everyone knows where we're at. This area off of what is today Coach Light Lane, there was a plat that was approved by the City Planning Commission in 1973. It was a 3-lot plat that covered 4.1 acres. At the time that was done, there was not obviously Mulberry Creek was there, the interstate was there, but there was no regulatory floodway there that had floodway regulations. But in 1974, a motel building known as the Coach Light Inn was built, and there were additions and additional square footage that was built during the mid-1970s. All of the buildings were constructed in a 3-year period by pile construction. There was no regulatory floodway at the time. In 1982, the city created a special assessment district to upgrade what was a KDOT frontage road to a public street to what is today called Coach Light Lane. The city was comprehensively rezoned and remapped, and the area where the hotels are was zoned commercial. There was a farmhouse at the end of the road, and it was zoned agricultural. In 1986, the city entered into the National Flood Insurance Program and adopted floodway regulations. In 2007, there was a 100-year flood on Mulberry Creek, and the farmhouse was substantially damaged by flooding and eventually removed from the site. In 2010, the comprehensive plan that we currently have was adopted, and it showed the area that we're discussing today as a conservation area. So the area that's outlined in blue there is the 6.31 acres that Mr. Bakta has an option to purchase. The buildings that you see in the photograph are the old hotel buildings. All of those have been removed from the property, and there is a new hotel under construction there. That new hotel is under construction because this board in 2017 approved a floodway variance for that hotel. So as you see in the pictures there, the buildings that were there fell into somewhat disrepair, and they were all removed. And in May of 2017, you as a board considered a similar floodway variance application to allow new commercial construction to the east of this site. You reviewed a flood impact study report prepared by Joe File, and he is the same engineer that is working on this project. And so you approved that subject to a number of conditions. Those conditions were met. A building permit was issued, and the Comfort Inn and Suites motel on that site is nearing completion. Since that time, which was 2017 to the present, the city has adopted new floodplain maps that have gone into effect. This area did not change. It was floodway for Mulberry Creek before, it's floodway now. The primary difference is under the new regulations that were adopted, all new construction has to be 1 foot above the base flood elevation. Under the old rules, you just had to be at or above the 100-year flood elevation. So although this property is in the floodway, Mr. Bakta views it as, he's looked down as the Comfort Inn and Suites has gone up, and he sees this property as a potential site for future highway-oriented commercial development. And he is proposing to create 2 lots west of the Comfort Inn and Suites. and this will require extension of Coach Light Lane and some public utility lines. So John, I believe in there we have a blown up preliminary plat drawing, if we could put that on the screen. And maybe enlarge that a little bit. So this is the development concept that the applicant has. These are building footprints here and over here. And this is the plan on the hotel site to the east. This is Coach Light Lane, which would be extended into the site. And this is his engineer's plan for what is, from an engineering perspective, referred to as compensatory storage. So there's generally two ways that you can build in the floodway. One is if there's already existing buildings obstructing the floodway, you can replace those essentially one for one, and that's what was done with the hotels. The other thing that can be done is that you can compensate for any filling or raising that you do by excavating and creating additional storage area for floodwaters, and that is what the applicant's design engineer is proposing here. And so earlier this year in April, and Mr. Freiberger is your liaison from the Planning Commission and reviewed those requests, but Mr. Bakhta submitted 3 applications relating to this property. One was to change the future land use classification to commercial. One was to rezone the property to C7 highway commercial, and one was the submittal of this plat layout, which showed 2 lots for commercial development and extension of the street. In May of this year, the Planning Commission recommended approval of the land use change, and the City Commission concurred with that action. The Planning Commission also recommended approval of the zoning change, and that was concurred with by the City Commission, and then the Planning Commission approved this plat layout subject to a number of conditions. One condition was that no development shall occur in the proposed subdivision unless a floodway variance is approved by the Salina Board of Zoning Appeals based on a no-rise certificate prepared by a licensed professional engineer. And so based on those preliminary approvals, which are independent of your action today, that led Mr. Bakhta to move forward with this variance request. And he wants to try to create those 2 elevated building lots on the northern portion of the property and remove these sites from the mapped floodway based on their elevation. But he cannot engage in any filling or grading or excavating without the approval of a floodway variance. So in your packets, we indicated there is a flood study that was done by Mr. Joe File, and he also prepared the flood impact study for the hotels. And his report concludes that the applicant's grading plan meets the criteria for granting the floodway variance. And so based on that conclusion, this application was submitted. We've had notification of adjacent property owners, and you are conducting a public hearing today. The justification for the variance in Mr. Bakhta's eyes is that based on its proximity to and visibility from I-70, this property is more suitable for commercial than agricultural use. And so in order to move forward on this, you have to be satisfied that Mr. Bakhta's request meets the 5 findings or criteria for granting a variance. There has to be certification provided by a professional engineer demonstrating that the development will not result in any increase in flood levels, and you have to conclude that this will not increase flood heights or create additional threats to public safety or cause any violation of any other laws. So you've got a property for which C7 zone is pending. You have I-70 to the north. You have agricultural land to the south and to the west. And you have a future motel site with a building under construction as we speak. And so we provided you some information about what the building criteria is in C7. C7 allows things like restaurants and motels and businesses that cater to travelers on I-70. So that is the what the applicant is trying to target there. And so a floodway variance needs to be approved by this board before any development can occur. And the general rule is it's prohibited unless approved as a variance, and there is certification by a professional engineer demonstrating that the encroachment shall not result in any increase in flood levels in the floodway. And so the burden's on Mr. Bakhta and his engineering consultant to demonstrate to you that the excavating, grading, and elevation of building pads will not increase the flood level on adjacent properties. So, John, we have, I think, some excerpted pages from the flood study from Mr. File. And we're going to have to blow those up. But this is a summary of the scenarios that he ran based on his grading plan. And so what you see in the left-hand column is the flood, what's known as the water surface elevation on Mulberry Creek on current conditions. And then based on what is proposed, he's showing what the water surface elevation would be if the plan is carried out. And so this is the before, this is the after. If his plan for grading and excavating is carried out, this is his conclusion. So you can see that the water surface in Mulberry Creek does not change at all if his plan is carried out as designed. If you could keep going, John, maybe if it to the conclusion, if you could back up and go to the conclusion. So this is the conclusion of his work. He is the one who studied Mulberry Creek for the cities and counties floodplain maps. He ran 2 different scenarios. His running the proposed grading plan through his models, he did not see any adverse impacts on the water surface elevation. And so if you go to the top of the next page, John, their engineer's summary is that his conclusion is development at this site based on the grading plan included in Exhibit A will not adversely impact the water surface elevation of the effective FEMA hydraulic model, and therefore, in his opinion, this plan meets the no-rise definition. And so, John, there is some the highlighted floodplain variance language. If you could go to that, please. So just to walk you through what your duties and responsibilities are for this particular hearing. The floodplain management ordinance designates you as the appeal board for this. Your job is to hear and decide requests for variances to floodplain management requirements of this article. If you could keep going, please, John. And so in passing upon this application, you should consider all the technical data that you've been provided, the standard criteria for variance, and then the following criteria. So as you think about this in your own mind, you're supposed to consider how this might impact or create danger to life and property due to flood damage. The applicant's engineer has concluded that there'll be no rise in creek surface elevations, therefore there should not be, if done correctly, any additional danger for property damage. The dangers that materials might be swept away onto other lands to injury to others. This is going to be fixed building improvements, and it's not going to be something where we're going to have things stored outdoors or anything that are likely to be swept away and to go downstream. The idea behind the borrow pit is to capture that water and detain it before it goes downstream. The susceptibility of the proposed facility and its contents to flood damage. We had close to a 100-year flood event on Mulberry Creek in May. Mr. Hers and I went out and took pictures. This particular property, as it existed today, had standing water on it. The hotel property, where you had approved a variance and a grading plan, was high and dry. And so the water was not even close. It wasn't even in their parking lot. So we acknowledge, and the applicant acknowledges, that based on the elevations today, it is susceptible to being covered by floodwater. But if he elevates the building pads and creates the storage, that should eliminate that. This is not a waterfront facility. It's not, doesn't have boat docks or anything like that, so that's not a relevant factor. One thing that we want the applicant to address that you're to consider is the availability of alternate locations that aren't subject to flood damage for the proposed uses. The compatibility of the proposed use with other development. The applicant views this as compatible with the hotels that are under construction. It matches up with the comprehensive plan based on the recent amendment. And then I would just make mention under number 9, that was something that the City Commission discussed, and just so that the board is clear and understands, and I think the applicant understands, the proposed elevation of the building sites would be 1225 above sea level. That's a full foot above the 100-year water surface elevation for Mulberry Creek. It's also slightly above the elevation of the motel sites. The one concern, or at least a thing to think about, is the fact that near the 9th Street intersection, the elevation of Coach Light Lane is about 1220. So there could be a scenario by which the guests in the motel or employees or customers are high and dry in their building, but there could be situations where Coach Light Lane could be impassable due to water, because this plan elevates the buildings and protects them. It doesn't necessarily elevate the existing road. So there could be situations where it would not be easy to get to the site. The two things that counterbalance that is, back in the 70s, the city put in public utilities, water, sewer, and a street to facilitate development. And so this is not just a greenfield where there's no city investment already made. So those are the things that counterbalance that. So we summarize the engineering's conclusion in the report, and then we've identified 3 alternatives for you. You could approve the requested floodway variance and the applicant's site grading plan with or without any conditions. If you think the required findings can be made, you can postpone action to a future meeting if you believe that additional information is required to make a decision in this case. You could deny the applicant's request if you don't think the findings needed to support a floodway variance can be made in this case. We have at your place drafted potential findings of fact in support of the variance, and you are certainly, as a board, within your prerogatives to decide this is a bad idea and a floodway variance should not be granted. We have drafted findings of fact in support. If you wish to deny this, we'll draft findings of fact to support denial. The reason that we took the approach of supporting this is, one, based on the conclusions of the engineer's report, and secondly, that this application has been and location has been reviewed extensively by the Planning Commission and City Commission, and they have given the applicant encouragement to go to this point and submit an engineering study. So based on the support given to this development of this parcel by the City Commission and Planning Commission to date, we think that findings can be made to support the requested variance. On page 13 and 14, we have laid out potential conditions of approval. And one thing we wanted to emphasize, well, two things we would emphasize, that it's based on this grading plan and this grading alone, and all this board is doing is authorizing dirt to be excavated, moved, and graded on the site. You are not authorizing or approving any proposed construction. If it reaches that point, then they will have to come back to this board separately, showing that they have their floodway permits from the state and that they have followed the grading plan, and at that point they can apply for a variance for new construction. But the idea that the applicant's trying to pursue is that, one, if he obtains approval to do the dirt work on the site, he's going to elevate building pads. Then he would apply to FEMA to get those building sites removed. That would allow him to market them as building sites, and if he successfully markets them as building sites, he will have to come back before this board with his construction plans for your review. So it's a lot of engineering, a lot of analysis, a lot of different terms that you don't usually see, but the applicant has gone out and gotten a very qualified individual to analyze this floodplain situation, and they have reached a conclusion that there will be no adverse effect on water surface elevations on Mulberry Creek.
Thank you, Mr. Andrew. Do we have any questions from the board for Mr. Andrew at this point? Well, I do. You mentioned Coach Light Lane, and this is the one thing that I think is the weakest part of the argument, and I don't know if we're entitled to even look at this anymore, except that we still have the phrase that the variance will not adversely affect the public health and safety in regard to this. So my first question is, am I correct that the two presently approved hotels on Coach Light Lane that are not completed are 200 units altogether, potentially?
You mean between the two?
Yeah, the sum of them is about 200 units, right?
The first one, I think, is roughly 104, something like that.
The way I recall it, it was about 200 units.
They're multi-story units. The first one is Comfort Inn and Suites. It's multi-story, and they're about to embark on construction of their second one. Yeah,
and together that's roughly 200 units. Yes. So potentially 400 people could be housed there during a flood condition or as at a flash flood condition. The next question then is, if this 6 acres were developed also with motels, would that be another couple hundred units? Do we have any rough idea, since, well, there should be a way to calculate a rough idea?
It doesn't have the, I mean, Mr. Bakhta can best speak to his vision. Most of the contacts he has had is with parties that were interested in restaurants that might serve the traveling public. So if we look at this plan, this is essentially a restaurant footprint, and this is what could be it. But the only thing we're having here is 2 building lots, one of which, this one isn't big enough to support a hotel, and this one, the footprint it's very conceptual, shows a potential hotel there. So potentially, if, and I'm trying to recall, I think the third building for the other site was also potentially a restaurant. Not, it has a footprint, but it's not limited. But don't we have the development concept for the other property,
Well,
John, that we could put up there?
but of course, some of that's enough in the future that the plans could be changed then on what's proposed on those lots. I mean,
The plans they cannot be changed without coming back to
but they
this
would have to
board.
come back here.
Yes.
But theoretically, they could be recombined and be a motel.
Yeah, so
Or
John, if you
something
could blow that up.
completely different than the current program, once it's zone C7 and this general.
So this
Site
is
improvement.
underway, and it's almost done. It's nearing.
Mm-hmm.
They'll be done with construction sometime during this month. This was the next item they were going to build,
So-
and this could be a restaurant or
Okay.
a motel.
My question then comes around to, in my humble observation, Coach Light's probably 5 feet below the projected maximum surface of the water. Is that anywhere close to, I'm sure that's correct, because I just was driving there and I'm looking level across
Yes,
for my
the-
car.
The numbers we got from the surveys is that these elevations are like 12, 24, 2, 3 in there. The proposed elevations over here would be 12, 25 for building pads. Out in this location, the elevation of Coach Light Lane itself is 12, 20. So you are correct. It's
4 to 5 feet.
4 to 5 feet different in elevation.
Right, and I've personally seen that flash flooded several times in the 30-some years I've lived here. So the danger to the public is if there are 400 people on that hotel and somebody needs an ambulance during a flash flood, they can't get in there. And that's just too bad, I guess. We do have, I know our fire department owns a high-powered boat that can get in there. I know that in the 2007 flash flood, a boat was used to rescue people from their homes in a flash flood condition relating to Mulberry Creek. So even if the flood is no worse than theoretical, if you put more people on the grounds and you put more people on that street overnight, you're increasing the potential public safety. I view that the approval of the first 2 hotels was done largely because it was replacing existing hotels that had been there for a long time. And it's kind of my feeling that the implications were, okay, it worked for 40 years, it's worth taking a chance for another period of time. And my opinion of the proceedings at that time was that then that's the end of development on Coach Light. So now all of a sudden we've got the potential to increase that public hazard. And that's the big difference I see, and in all the discussion we've had, I don't know whether that was discussed before the city commission or not when they changed the uses and approved the zoning tentatively.
Actually was, because I have my notes from where I was asked to address that in my report. And so the thinking there is that, and maybe it wasn't clearly conscious or thought through, but as the city commission looked at this and looked at that question, because that was, there's a couple things in response. When the newly adopted floodplain regulations were reviewed and they were adopted in April of 2018, there was it's an optional non-mandatory provision for requiring elevated roadways and also elevated roadways to critical facilities. So they had an option where you could require critical facilities such as hospitals or other things to have to be elevated 2 foot above base flood elevation and to require all roadways to be elevated. The City Commission reviewed that and made a conscious decision not to require streets or roadways to be elevated. That was the first part. The other thing that the City Commission looked at, and again, they may have not thought everything through, but there's, in terms of Mr. Bakhta's property as it relates to the hotel property, in 1971, the City Commission annexed this whole area, and they also annexed the property that Mr. Bakhta has brought forward. So there was a conscious decision to annex that, and it's been in the city since 1971. The other thing is that the city, it was done at developers' expense, but the city has worked and utilities have been extended, including a new water line system and all to support the hotels. And then the third thing the City Commission did was in 2015, they expanded the boundaries of the neighborhood revitalization area, which is an incentive to reinvest or redevelop, and they included the hotel site, and they also included Mr. Bakhta's site in there, which was at least some indication that they were treating Mr. Bakhta's site as equal to or equivalent to the hotel site. So those were all the things that the City Commission weighed in their decision making, and then it is a plain fact that our floodplain regulations, the primary focus is to prevent property damage and also to prevent, from a public safety standpoint, flooding of buildings, but our regulations are not necessarily designed to protect flooding of streets. And if anyone is a longtime resident of Salina, and maybe even Dustin has seen it and experienced it, but we have had situations where every house in a subdivision was high and dry, but we had city employees who couldn't get to work because the water was 18 inches deep in their street in front of the house. So the goal is to prevent property damage and keep buildings and occupants safe from flooding, but there are situations, not just here, but other places in town where people are safe and dry in their homes or their buildings, but they can't necessarily get anywhere because of the water. So we're telling you, and it'd be a fact in the record, that the elevation proposed for the building site's 1225, but the elevation of Coach Light Lane in some spots is 1220. So there could very well be circumstances where the development is high and dry. Mr. Hers and I went out there in May and took pictures, and the hotel site was very high and dry. The creek was at the top of the banks. It was touching the bottom of the 9th Street Bridge. However, Coach Light Lane was still open. There was no coverage of water. And so the only other variable as it relates to Coach Light Lane, which would have nothing to do with this particular development, there's a pretty large drainage system on Diamond Drive north of the interstate. All of that drains to a ditch that's on against I-70. There's actually a culvert and box that goes underneath I-70, comes out the south side and runs down to Mulberry Creek. So John, I don't know if you can go to an aerial photo of this area for us and whether it can show that area or not.
Much of that drainage that you just described is full of water right now. I mean,
yes.
2 hours ago when I drove by it.
When Mr. Hers and I were out there taking pictures, the area between the I-70 ramp and Coach Light Lane was full of water, right. And it wasn't affecting the interchange ramp, and it wasn't affecting Coach Light Lane, but that area in between was was
That's
carrying water.
that's a sufficient answer for me. Any other questions for the staff?
Is this ground currently being used for crops or CRP, anything of that sort?
Mr. Bachta would have to answer that question. But just to go back to what I was referring to, there's a ditch along here, there's a box, the water actually goes under I-70, comes along right here, goes under Coach Light Lane here and drops into Mulberry Creek. So sometimes this area here between Coach Light Lane and the interstate ramps is full of water. It may be full of water right now, but
The north side is.
yeah, this
partially.
is the piece that we're talking about. So there was a farmhouse there, but I'm not sure about the cultivation or what it's used for. So, Roger, if you want to address that.
I'm Roger Bachta, 1220 West North, Salina. Right now, the part of it, we stopped doing any agriculture work right now because we are so close to the, completion of everything. So we kind of stopped it, but yeah, last year before it was agriculture, there was used for agriculture.
Let's see. If there are no further questions for the staff, Mr. Bachta is invited to make any comments he would like to make at this time. If he has no comments, are there any questions for the sponsor at this time?
We do have, staff does have one question just to kind of get it into the record for the meeting. Mr. Owens here is a engineer for working with Mr. Bachta, and if he could just kind of briefly explain for you the concept behind the borrow area or the compensatory storage, how from an engineering standpoint that's supposed to work, just so we can get that into the record.
Okay.
So John, if you could put that preliminary plat up and switch to that. So this is our borrow area or compensatory storage and detention and everything else. But if you could kind of just get a brief overview of how that would function as it relates to Mulberry Creek.
So the pond was basically, the main purpose of it is we need to elevate the site. So we've created an area that can provide us enough soil so that we can build the site up, get it out of the floodplain. This also provides, the area that used to store water where the site's going to be now, we've added this volume to this pond. So the amount of storage within the floodplain and the floodway itself is not reduced, but we basically replaced it in kind. It also functions as a detention pond for the facility too.
Yeah, so runoff generated from parking lots and such here will go into this pond, be stored, and then this is the release point, right here.
Yes, that would be
Okay. Any further questions for the sponsors consultants? If there are no questions of the staff or the sponsor, I guess we need a motion. Is there a motion?
Yeah, we want to see if there's any members of the public that
That's
might
right.
want
I
to
forgot to
comment
ask.
on this.
Are there any? There are a lot of members of the public in this audience. Are there any questions from the public or comments from the public at this time on this application? Okay, there being none of those, may we have a motion?
I would make a motion to approve application B19-4 with the 4 staff recommendations and based on the finding of facts supplied by city staff.
Is there a second to Mr. Owen?
I'll second that.
Okay. So we have motion and a second. Any further discussion on the board? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
The chair remains opposed on the grounds that I don't think the public safety considerations are being met because of the flooding of the street. The motion passes, and we can continue to the next item on our agenda.
One thing we would add in that regard that the city manager acknowledged at the city commission meeting that if the elevation of the street or the crossing there at 9th Street is an issue, then it's going to be something for the city to solve. It's not something that Mr. Bacta can solve for
Right.
us, so.
It's a Mother Nature thing that probably cannot be solved. But at any rate, let us proceed now with that application approved. Thank you, Mr. Bacta, for your patience and time and expense getting thus far. Good luck with the new hotels and future development.
It's not acting like it should.
Next application is V 19-5, filed by Nathan Davis, requesting a variance to the maximum number of storage sheds allowed on a residential property to allow 2 existing backyard storage sheds, which are less than 120 square feet in size, to remain on his lot. The property that is the subject of this application is legally described as the west 127.5 feet of Lot 1 in the Berg addition to the city of Salina, Saline County, Kansas, and it is addressed as 108 East Bond Street. May we have the staff report?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Board. So the applicant's address or the subject property of this particular item is located at the southeast corner of the Santa Fe and Bond intersection. So up there on the screen is the location that we're going to be discussing. The property is part of the Berg addition, which was platted in 1912, and the existing structure was constructed in 1930. When it was constructed, there was an attached garage here that has since been removed as it became dilapidated and was pulling away from the house and was potentially causing structural issues, so it was removed. So currently, the applicant's property does not have a detached garage and has the 2 sheds that we are going to discuss as this item. So the applicant, Mr. Davis, recently called into the Development Services Office and inquired about permits necessary for an 8 by 12, 96 square foot shed. At that point in time during that conversation, he was informed that any storage shed less than 120 square feet did not require a building permit, but had to meet certain setback and bulk regulation requirements, such as being out of the front yard setback area and having a 3-foot setback off the side yard. So the applicant proceeded with erecting a storage shed, but also erected a second one, which was then discovered by staff. And so what has happened now is the applicant has 2 storage sheds, no attached or detached garage, and would like to keep the 2 storage sheds, and that is the nature of this particular request. As part of his request, the applicant is proposing and agreeing to forfeit his right to construct an attached or detached garage, or excuse me, a detached garage at a later date, so that he would still only have 2 single structures. So the accessory use section of the zoning ordinance allows for a residential property owner to have 1 storage shed not exceeding 360 square feet, as well as an additional detached garage not to exceed 770 square feet. And so you could potentially have 2 accessory structures by right according to the zoning ordinance. And the primary distinction being that a storage shed has man doors, does not have doors sized for vehicles, and a storage shed does not have a driveway necessarily accessible to the street, where a garage would have to have a driveway that connects that storage structure to a street frontage of some kind. In 2003, city staff created an administrative interpretation in which we decided that you could have 1 accessory structure of 360 square feet and 1 accessory structure of 770 square feet, but it didn't necessarily matter which one was the garage and which one was the storage shed. In other words, during that, as part of that administrative interpretation, it was determined that you could have permitted by code and a detached storage structure up to 770 square feet, and then a detached garage up to 360 square feet. So that was a determination that was made and was in effect until 2016, at which time the city attorney's office overturned and overruled that administrative interpretation and said that it has to strictly be one detached garage of up to 770 square feet and one storage shed up to 360 square feet. When we look at the surrounding zoning, John, if we can pop up the zoning map. The surrounding area is residential. Primarily, most of the properties are R1, which is the yellow that you see. The subject property, if you scroll down just a little bit, it's off the page there, is R2, which is the medium brown, and the darker brown is the R3. So the subject property is R2, and most of the surrounding properties, with the exception of the property directly to the east, are R1 single family. In looking at the applicant's statements of uniqueness for the property and how it is unique from other in the area, he does state that the garage that was on site has been removed, and so he doesn't have any storage. He has 4 elementary school-aged children and a lot of bicycles and possessions that require storage, and his backyard has a large elm tree. And when he says backyard, he is talking about, if we can go to an aerial photo that's zoomed in, this could work as well. When he's talking about backyard, he's referring to his east yard. So because the property is a corner lot with frontage on Santa Fe and Bond, it has 2 front yards and then 2 side yards that are side yards to the front yard and no actual rear yard. However, the structure does have an exterior door, exterior exit on the east side where it is fenced in, and so this functions as his family's backyard. Right where you see this shaded area is a large mature elm tree, and the applicant states that the presence of this elm tree requires him to have 2 separate storage sheds rather than one unified merged larger shed, and that's seen in we do have a photograph here. So there's a storage shed here, and then right off the page there's another storage shed here. So these are the 2 storage sheds that are subject of this conversation. The alternative, and what also makes the property unique, if we go to the aerial photo, is in lieu of having a storage shed in what the applicant would refer to his backyard, which is the east side of his house, the other option is the west side of the house, but that happens to be in the front yard area, the area between Santa Fe, which is a local arterial street that we have here in Salina, and the residence. And having a large storage structure here, he feels, could detract more from the neighborhood than the 2 smaller individual storage sheds that he has. In looking at the adverse effects of the neighborhood, the applicant states that the sheds are newer sheds in excellent condition. They are painted in the same colors as the house with a gray body paint and white trim that matches the residential dwelling. The sidewalls are less than 10 feet and certainly less than the sidewalls of the house, which is a 2-story house with a maximum peak of approximately 26 feet. The applicant hasn't had any complaints from any of the neighbors, and staff can also verify that we have not received, up to this point in time anyway, any complaints or thoughts or concerns from any of the neighbors either. The applicant believes that constructing a larger single storage shed on the west side in the front yard area that we showed you just a moment ago between the house and Santa Fe here would actually have a greater detrimental effect on the neighborhood than the existing sheds, and staff would agree with that as well. Looking at the hardship of the proposed 2 storage sheds. If the applicant were to have, remove one of the storage sheds, he would have to tear down a newer structure, and he also would have to remove the existing tree in order to create enough space for a larger shed, merging the 2 spaces together to have enough space for his family and all of their items and possessions. In looking at the effect on the public health and safety, the applicant states that the 2 storage sheds are located in their backyard, and that there is a 6-foot privacy fence that surrounds the sheds and makes them, for the most part, imperceivable to the neighbors, and really limits the impact and inconvenience it would have on the neighbors. And staff would agree that the 2 sheds don't seem to limit or block sunlight, air movement, water runoff, or risk of fire spread, and that having the screened-in privacy fence certainly does help to screen the storage structures and limit their visible inconveniences on the neighbors. Conformity and general spirit and intent of the zoning ordinance. The purpose and intent of having numerical and size limitations of storage structures is to keep residential areas looking residential, keeping the neighborhoods that are designed for people to live at, keeping their character residential, and not having them inundated with a lot of clutter and structures, both in the number of structures as well as the bulk of the structures. And staff believes that the design and materials, as well as the smaller bulk that both of these structures have, both of them being under 100 square feet apiece, do conform to the general spirit and intent of the ordinance and don't detract from the visual appearance of the property or the neighborhood. On the bottom of page 10, we do have a summary of possible findings for you to consider. And with that, the board could approve a variance if you find that the number of storage sheds allowed would be in keeping with the findings of fact, and the findings of fact can be made. And the board could postpone action on this application if additional information is needed, and the board could deny the applicant's variance request if you feel like the findings of fact that staff has proposed as possible findings cannot be made. The staff recommendation that we would have on this is that we believe that the 2 existing storage sheds are residential in appearance, meet all the height and setback requirements, and are compatible with the residential dwelling, and that the 6-foot privacy fence does a good job of limiting potential negative impacts that could be had on the neighbors. As a result, we would recommend the approval of the variance request with one condition, and that condition is that no more than 2 accessory structures be allowed for this particular property, meaning that no additional storage sheds or a detached garage be allowed without an additional variance modification by this board, or one of the existing storage sheds being removed to be replaced by said new shed or garage. With that, we will take any questions you might have.
Have we any questions?
Would that recommendation stay with the property or the owner?
It would stay with the property. All of the decisions that the Board of Zoning Appeals makes are based on the uniqueness of the property and not necessarily attributes of the individual. So when you make a decision, what you're saying is that this particular property is unique in these certain ways, or that there is a certain element of hardship associated with this property that is different and special, and these special rules are going to apply to this property, hence going forward.
Any other questions for staff? Does Mr. Davis have any comments or at this point?
I would just add that originally when I built the shed, there was like 2-year difference between the 2 sheds when I built them. And so I didn't really intend to defy the ordinance. I just figured, well, I didn't have enough room with one, so I'm gonna build another one.
And any questions for Mr. Davis from the board?
We don't have a solution for it, but it's, staff acknowledges that it's a little bit of a challenge when the answer to the question of whether you need a permit or not is no, but whether there are certain rules in place that you still need to abide by is yes. Sometimes you have to, we still like to finish the sentence besides just saying no permits required, but there are other requirements that come into play. So it's challenging when you have rules for structures, but you're not required to get a permit to put one up. So that's something that's a public education challenge that falls to us to do better on.
Just curious, were neighbors notified in reference to the appearance of the neighborhood with the two sheds?
Yes. With all variance requests, we are required by state statutes to notify all of the adjacent property owners as well as have a legal notification in the Salina Journal. So we notify all neighbors through those two mechanisms.
All right, well, thank you. And are there any comments from the general public? Comments or questions? Okay, I got that part of the agenda in there. Bring it back to the board. Any further discussion, or do we have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I'd make a motion that application V 19-5, filed by Nathan Davis, be approved by this committee with one staff recommendation that no more than 2 accessory buildings shall be allowed on the lot, and no additional accessory buildings or storage sheds or detached garage shall be permitted on the lot without approval of the Board of Zoning Appeals.
I second that motion.
So we have a motion and a second. Any last-minute discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Motion passes unanimously. Thanks for clarifying the confusion and going through the process, Mr. Davis. May proceed. Next application and final one for today is number V 19-6, filed by Travis Coleman, requesting a maximum storage building size variance of 240 square feet from 360 square feet, which is the maximum storage building size allowed in an R single-family residential district, for a maximum of 600 square feet to allow the construction of a 20 by 30 foot rear yard storage building. The property that is subject to this application is legally described as Lot 14, Block 6 in the replat of Bonnie Ridge addition to the city of Salina, Kansas, Saline County, and addressed as 750 Scott Avenue. May we have the staff report?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are, this is a similar variance and deals with accessory outbuilding. As Mr. Hers indicated, life was a little simpler for owners and for the board. In 2003, staff made an administrative interpretation that you can have one accessory building up to 770 square feet and one up to 360 square feet. And we took the position that the owner could choose which one was the larger of the two. And if you chose to build a larger workshop, then you'd have to have a smaller garage. But the city attorney made a written interpretation that the storage building cannot exceed 360 square feet without the approval of a variance. So this is a situation where it's a property in the Bonnie Ridge addition, and the Bonnie Ridge addition is located on the south side, on the east, excuse me, it should say west of Ohio Street in the Bonnie Ridge addition. And that dates back to 1964. The home on this lot was built in 1977. It's a 1,620 square foot, 3-bedroom home and has a 20 by 20 attached garage. There is a 10 by 16 storage shed that was built in the backyard in 2003. In 2014, this property was purchased by the applicant's parents who live next door at 742 Scott Avenue, and the applicant is currently buying this property on contract. So in May of this year, the applicant applied for a building permit to construct a 20 by 30 storage building workshop in the southeast corner of the backyard where the shed is currently located. So you can barely see the red outline, but this is an existing shed, and that's the outline of a proposed building. It was reviewed by staff, and we determined that it was, in fact, a storage building or workshop, and that it exceeded the 360 square foot size limit. So we sent a plan review letter to the applicant and said you have the option of converting this building into a garage with a driveway connection, or reducing the size to 360 square feet, or applying for a maximum storage building size variance. And the property owner chose to file this application seeking to justify the need for the larger building size. So the proposal is to construct a 600 square foot building with metal siding. In one, I noticed in my report that in one place I made reference to it as having a shingled roof, and another place a metal roof. We would want to get that clarified from the applicant, because the original drawings and the one you have in your packet has a metal roof, but we received a response, plan review response, that indicated that that might be changed to a shingled roof. But the justification for this variance, the applicant states that he needs the additional size over 360 square feet because that limit does not provide sufficient space for a woodworking shop due to the need for space to accommodate woodworking equipment and materials. And so the maximum size you can have a storage building by right is 360 square feet. The applicant indicates that the costs associated with pouring a driveway to the building would be prohibitive for this project, and that due to a west utility easement and power line, the driveway could only reach the back of the property from the east, which is opposite where the existing driveway is. As we look at unique conditions, these lots in Bonnie Ridge are pretty uniformly sized. They're pretty uniformly shaped. But what is unique about the applicant's lot is the lack of access to the rear yard. Staff believes that even if it weren't cost prohibitive, that there's not sufficient width to construct a driveway along the east side of the house to get to what could be a garage. The applicant doesn't think that a building of this size will adversely affect the right of adjacent owners because the design and appearance is compatible with the existing dwelling. He states it will be located in a back corner, with less intrusive than a detached garage, and there won't be the impact of all the additional concrete or passing traffic that would be involved with a rear yard garage. What we would note, and we've reviewed and discussed these before, metal garages and metal storage buildings are discouraged, but they're not prohibited in residential areas due to their tendency to have a commercial appearance. What we do require is that detached garages and residential storage buildings be compatible in design, appearance, and materials, and to achieve that, you have to have at least 3 points of compatibility with the house on the lot. So the applicant's dwelling has brick and hardy board lap siding and asphalt shingles. The building originally proposed by the applicant had metal siding and a metal roof, so that would not be compatible, but the roof style was similar to the style of the house. The sidewall height was similar, and the plan was to have it gray with white trim to match the house, so that was potentially 3 points of compatibility. Since the original submittal, we don't have a drawing for it, but the applicant has indicated that he was going to reduce the interior height, lowering the roof peak to 11 feet 10 inches, add an even gable overhang, reduce the entry door width, and instead of having metal roof, have architectural shingles. So We would request that the applicant clarify whether the building will have a metal roof or shingled roof. Staff was contacted by a neighboring property owner who questioned the need for a storage building that was 20 by 30 in size and suggested that there was more space for a building that size in the southwest corner of the lot. So John, if you could go back to the overview of the lot. Given the arrangement of things on the property, there actually is a little more space in this corner due to the additional depth here than there is on the southeast side. As far as hardship, the applicant indicates that at 360 square feet, he could not store all his woodworking equipment and materials, let alone accommodate the safe usage of those tools. Staff would request, we think it's been shown that it's not feasible to get a driveway there, but we would request the applicant to provide additional information about the hardship that would result if this was reduced to 360 feet. And that could include providing a list of items planned to be placed in the building. We don't see any impact on public health and safety. If it's located in the southeast corner, the primary impact would be on the property to the east. If it's located in the southwest corner, the primary impact would be on the properties that are to the west. And so the applicant again points out that he believes that the building will be compatible in appearance with the dwelling on the lot. It is correct that a garage of the same size could be built there without a variance. And as Mr. Hers indicated, our regulations are designed to try to keep residential areas looking residential by not allowing garages or storage buildings that become commercial in nature. And so the proposed location meets all zoning ordinance requirements. There is a 7-foot wide utility easement at the rear, and the location is outside of that easement. And it is correct that a 24 by 32 garage could be built in the backyard here if there was driveway access and an overhead door. So we did have the elevation drawings. I think you had that up there, John. It would have a gable style pitched metal roof. Would have a roof height slightly below the roof height of the dwelling. The building would have metal siding, and the applicant has indicated that he's considering a change to shingles instead of a metal roof. So the two items that don't conform is the size, which exceeds the limit by 240 square feet. And because it is a metal building, they need to achieve 3 points of compatibility because it doesn't have the same type of siding as the house. As we looked at the neighborhood, and I think we had the aerial photo up, but as we looked up and down Scott Street, there is only one building of a similar size on the lots on the south side of the block. And I have researched that and found that a permit was issued for a garage at Scott Avenue 766, and it should not have been issued because there was no driveway access to the garage, but that was being done at the plans were being reviewed at a different point in time, but it was built as a garage. I don't know how it's used, but there is no driveway access to it. So we've identified 5 alternatives on this case. One is to approve the storage size, building size variance as requested. You could approve a lesser variance than requested, such as 480 square feet instead of 600 square feet. You could approve the storage building size variance, but direct the applicant to relocate the building to the southwest corner where there's more space for a building of that size. You could postpone action on this application to a future meeting, or you could deny the applicant's size variance request. We do believe this building is residential in appearance and proportional. We would request that the applicant provide the board with additional information about the hardship that would result if this were limited to a reduced size, and hardship that might result if it were relocated to the southwest corner of the lot where there's more space. So if those things are provided to the satisfaction of the board, we had 6 recommended conditions. Number 6 was similar to the last case where the storage building would be approved in lieu of having a rear yard garage, and so no permit could be issued for a rear yard detached garage in addition to this building. However, if in the future an owner wanted to convert this building to a garage and was able to get sufficient space for vehicle access, it would permit this to be converted to a garage if it met the criteria, but it would not allow for an additional building. But we think the 2 main points would be what is the need for the additional space, what sort of woodworking equipment are we trying to accommodate, and then the second question would be, is it feasible to relocate this to the southwest corner instead of the southeast corner of this lot? So with that, staff would be available for any questions.
Have we any questions for staff?
So if this was built as a garage, this wouldn't have to, it wouldn't have came in
If
front of
this
the
is
board?
built as a garage, it would not have to come before the board because it's less than 770 square feet. But in order for it to be a garage, there would have to be a way to get a driveway from Scott Avenue all the way back to it, and it'd have to have an overhead door. So the primary distinction, as we've discussed, between a garage and a storage building is a garage has an overhead door of sufficient size to get a vehicle in, and if you want to have a garage, it has to be accessible from a street or alley. And so this is not being used as a garage, or would not be used as a garage, and would not be built as a garage. What we're discussing and looking at as a possible future amendment is to take our interpretation that we used to have and put it into in a formal amendment where in the future would simply allow the property owner to decide you get one building of this size, one building of this size, you can choose which one. And I think that makes sense, but as it stands now, since the size limit for a storage building is 360, for him to build this as a storage building and to be 600 square feet, he has to get your approval.
There being no further questions for staff, would Mr. Coleman like to make a comment?
Travis Coleman, 750 Scott Avenue. I've got a list of all the tools that would be going in there and equipment. I've also got basically my response to why I wouldn't want to move to the other side of the backyard. I don't know if you want me to read them or pass them out.
Sure, just pass them out, be fine.
Pass out your list and they can look at it up there, and if you want to give the highlights of it.
Thanks. So you'll see more than just woodworking equipment on there. One of, my first degree is in arts, and so I'm a local artist. I've done the River Festival twice. I have a lot of equipment that I just store to take places and go do demonstrations when I do them. You'll see that on there. I also have a lot of random hobbies that are hard to explain, so I thought woodworking was the simplest way to explain it. I'm also a lapidary, a jeweler, as a hobby, not as a business. And I'm running out of space to, I have a 20 by 20 garage, a 14 by 15 basement workshop, and the current 120 square foot shed. And my original intention was just to expand the shed in its same location by double the length and double the width. And so as an experiment, I took the day off work yesterday and went through everything in my 20 by 20 garage. I have not done any public speaking in a while. I'm nervous. So, you pass these pictures around. These are the 3 existing workspaces. That is after I put everything back in the garage after completely cleaning it out.
So you can almost get one automobile in there, maybe.
But, so currently I have to pull out the tool I want to work with and work in the center. And the scariest part has been with the table saw. Because you need, if you're working on a 4x8 sheet, you need at least that much room for it to come out the outfeed. And I've had a couple of scary incidents with that being in the middle of the garage. I also have a 16-month-old son who's getting more mobile. And I'd like it if I could have a contained space where I can keep all of my tools so he doesn't get into that, especially when I'm working and the noise is loud.
I don't know if you have the answer, but what is the square footage of your garage?
It's 20 by 20, it would be 400. Oh, and so I noticed in the recommendations, I didn't have any qualms with anything except for moving it to the southwest corner. And that's what the response is for. 480 square feet, I think after cleaning that out and looking would be plenty. I think that would be perfect. Also, the compatibility list, I went ahead and redid it with a photo. I guess I should talk into the microphone. And really, I'm flexible on any of that. The only reason why I went with metal siding on the outside was because that's what the existing building is made of. Since I'm demoing the existing building now, I'm perfectly fine with making the siding match my house. And the roof, we're getting a new roof, so we're just gonna get more of the same shingles when we do the roof and put those on the storage building. So that confirms that, yeah, I'm doing shingles for the shed instead of metal.
Okay.
And I realize that you have that at your place there. If Mr. Coleman could just articulate for the minutes what you see as problems. If we were just looking at it from an aerial photo perspective, and you have your garage and everything on the west side already. So if you could just articulate for the board why you think that would be problematic to shift the location to the southwest, then we can just get that in the record.
So the first reason is because of the angle of the backyard fence. Our lots are pie-shaped, and the back lot is at a funny angle to the pie shape. I don't know if you can bring up, I guess you can kind of see it on that picture.
Is this a fence here?
That's the current fence, which you don't need a permit to move a fence back.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, this blue line represents the property line. We have different things in the community. Some, like in the case of my own property, I don't want my fence in the utility easement because that means it's subject to getting smashed or relocated by the utility company. So some people put their fences on the edge of the utility easement. Some people put them on the property line. It's at the owner's choice to do that, but it appears to me that there's a strip behind your fence that you own and are responsible for, but the fence is inside the property line.
So the idea would be to move that fence back to the property line. We've been working with Fox Landscaping, and we're trying to make our yard as easily maintained as possible. The angle on the southwest side is an acute angle, and so to meet the setbacks from the easements, it would essentially move it more into the center of my yard and less be on an edge.
So you're saying that there's a utility easement through, or there's a power pole or something going through?
There's a power pole. There's a power pole right here.
Okay.
And it provides power to 3 houses. When they originally built the fence on the property, the way I understand it, is instead of building the fence along the line with the pole on the property line, they shifted it over to the other side of the easement and the other neighboring yards to just make it easier, like one continuous fence instead of having a power pole, because then 3 people would have to tear down their fence if they replace the poles. Number 2, the power poles have been there as long as I have, 35, and I've lived next door most of the time. Same power poles. They're kind of scary. Sometimes they sway. The access to that, if I build a building on the left side, they couldn't just take out the left side of the fence and go straight in. They would have to go diagonal across my backyard. That's also where the gas lines run for, I believe, 3 of the houses. At least 2 I know, but possibly 3 are along that utility easement on the left. Let's see. The shed's always been in the southeast corner. Wait. It's always been where it's at. And so as such, there's a sprinkler system back there that's built everywhere except on that side. I'd have to move 6 heads to move it onto the other side. Where the current one is at, there's no sprinklers over there except for maybe one in the bottom corner, and that would be moving anyway. Also, let's see, the existing shed has electricity to it. I don't know what you have to do if you build a new building, if you have to rip the electricity out anyway, but I just thought if it's already there, why redo it? And then, let's see. So my neighbor who used to work for the city told me there's a potential that there is also a buried pool under that part of my backyard. I don't know. But there's a potential.
It was a puzzlement to me, but I found, as I was researching the address file, that there was a house built in '77, and shortly after the house was built, a permit was taken out for a 20 by 24 in-ground pool. But I don't know if the pool ever got built, or if it got built, maybe it got filled in, but records do indicate that at one time there was an in-ground pool behind that house. So.
Okay. That's pretty much it. I don't really want to dig it.
Any questions for Mr. Coleman?
So if I could, and maybe to help the board and maybe help staff summarize, the applicant seems to have indicated, if we get this clarified, that if the board was to approve 480 square feet in lieu of 600, that would be acceptable. And so as we look to the various options, one option is to approve a lesser variance than requested, which would be to go to 480 instead of 600 square feet. And then we would strike, based on his comments, we would strike the relocation to the southwest corner, but it would have to be located at least 5 feet from any side lot line. And then if the maker of any motion wants to stipulate that the siding be match the house in lieu of metal building, you could make that a condition, and then that would help staff formulate a building permit. But that's the 2 things that I took out of that, or 3 things, were that 1, you could reduce the size to 480. 2, you could stipulate that it be a siding to match the house instead of a metal building. And 3, you could strike the requirement to moving it to the southeast corner based on the reasons that the applicant has provided.
Okay, with that, do we have any further questions for either staff or the sponsor, or if not?
I do have one. If it was touched upon by Mr. Andrew that the house is being purchased contract for deed, do you have permission from the actual people who have the fee simple title to the property?
Yes, they have
Okay.
signed the application. The owners have signed the application and authorized. We would not have accepted the application without their consent, so.
All right, just checking, thanks.
Now, any further discussion and/or motion, please?
So,
Is there any-
again,
is there-
we're
speak from the
focusing
public?
on page 7.
Oh, I
and
keep
eight.
forgetting to ask if there are any comments from the public. One more time, are there any additional comments from the general public or concerns? Okay, we have one. Please come to the microphone, identify yourself by name and address.
I'm LaDonna Taves. I live on the adjacent property of the site he's going to build it, 756 Scott Avenue. I guess my main concern is I'm a master gardener. I'm retired and back there gardening all the time. There's a lot of debris around the building that's existing now, and there's old wood. There are trees growing into my fence that I kill because I don't want them to ruin my fence. And so I guess I'm just asking if you approve it on my side of the yard to be larger than it is now, if you could stipulate that things aren't stored around the building, because that's what's happening at the current time. That's my main concern of wanting it in the other corner rather than mine. Thanks.
Do we need a response from the owner? Yeah, that'd be fine, please.
So one of the reasons why we're doing the landscaping and this stuff is to get some of the stuff that's out on the yard stored inside, like the lawn tractor and the cement mixer. So that will help with that. The plan is also to pour concrete behind it as close as I can, and then kill all the grass back there so that nothing else grows back there and helps with that issue.
So what will end up on top of that concrete?
Nothing. No, it'll just be open.
Okay.
I mean, is that a problem?
Well, it just seems strange to have concrete just to kill grass, if
Well, I mean,
that's what it is.
I have rocks currently, and the rocks don't do the job, even with black plastic under them. And then, yeah.
Okay, you have all these interests, but gardening is not one of them, apparently. Okay.
It was for a short period of time.
Just for, and I have not, I can't confirm, and I can.
I know, I'm terrible. Excuse me.
I was thinking the same thing.
I'm not positive about what the current setback is. I believe that the setback of the existing shed that's there is 3 feet, and one of the conditions we have is that this building would have to be set back 5 feet, so it would be 2 feet farther back from the neighbor's property line, and then it is within your discretion. The rationale generally for having larger storage buildings or additional space is to get more stuff inside.
Yeah.
So it is within your discretion to stipulate that in exchange for the larger storage building, that there be no woodworking materials or other types of things stored outside the building. Yeah, that is within your discretion.
Is there also some kind of, I didn't look, I should have, stipulation that it can't be used as a business?
Yes.
Yes.
And that's
Stipulation 5 is used for personal storage, personal use, and not for any business purpose. We have lots of woodworkers who are hobbyists and ceramic people that are hobbyists and people that are hobbyists, and the primary purpose is not to have it turn into a business location. But just because it's not people who are intensive hobbyists, they can still produce things that they can take somewhere else for sale. But the business aspect of it is not to have business transactions or things like that taking place on the property. We've had 2 cases where the board approved variances for oversized garages, and somewhat later, after the board approved them, they became the location of pickup bedliner businesses, installation businesses, and that kind of violated the spirit of what the board was trying to approve. So we generally have that as a condition on there, just as a reminder. it's already in the ordinance. But as we've tried to address this, we already have a condition that it has to be 5 feet from the side lot line. The current one is 3. The applicant has indicated that he's willing to use siding that matches the house, which would make the building more compatible. And if we add a stipulation about no outdoor storage of woodworking materials or equipment, that is a condition that you could add as well.
I'm not sold on the size for the hardship reasoning. I just went through the list of tools provided, and almost everything on the list I have in my 2-car garage right now, with 2 vehicles in there. So, as a hobbyist myself, I mean, you can look at my check marks. I do woodworking as well, so.
And I'll just bring it back to the Planning Commission. You all know what we think, I think, about oversized storage buildings, especially if they aren't really compatible with the structure or they're oversized for the area.
But if as described by the applicant, and as I have the list not filled out, but the list in the packet, if the applicant changes this from metal siding to siding that matches the house, essentially the building that he's proposing to build would have 5 points of compatibility with the house. And then the only thing, he is taking a step from 600 down to 480 square feet. So it's our thinking with the 5-foot setback, with the no outdoor storage, with the reduction to 480 square feet, and the change from metal siding to conventional siding and asphalt shingles, that the applicant has come up with a structure that's much more compatible than where we started originally with the original permit. So,
are those conditions acceptable to Mr. Coleman at this point? It's somewhat smaller, but still it's 4 times bigger than the present building. Okay. Now, is anyone willing to make a motion regarding that variant of the application, or regarding the application with all these considerations? You're not going to make the chairman make a motion, are you?
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve the building at 480 square feet and with the provisions on, let me give you this page number here.
Page 8.
Page 8 of the request, and with the added stipulation that it have the 5 points of compatibility rather than the 3. No outside storage. And the storage building is approved in lieu of a rear yard detached garage.
Is there a second to Mr. Fanning's motion?
I'll second that.
Okay, so we have a motion that I don't think needs to be repeated again at this point.
We're
with
just
some
clarifying
restrictions, and essentially for the approval of a 480 square foot storage building with the exterior compatible to the house, and with a slightly enlarged setback from the neighboring property compared to the current smaller storage building. So if we're all in favor of that, or all those in favor of that motion, please say aye.
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 We
did have a second by Mr. Holmgren.
Okay, we want to
Mr. Fanning,
clarify for the Crystal's record keeping that we are interpreting that as we're keeping the building in the southeast corner, so the motion does not include shifting it to the southwest corner.
That's my understanding, correct. Yes. Okay, thank you, Mr. Fanning.
So we have a motion and a second to leave it in the southeast corner, reduce it from 600 to 480, and to eliminate any outdoor storage, and that the compatibility in design materials and colors must have 5 points of compatibility.
Correct.
So I think we have that all recorded.
Okay, and we're now in agreement one more time. We did have unanimous voting on favor of that, or have we voted yet? Are we, I've lost track. May we take the vote? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Are there any opposed?
Aye.
Aye.
So I think that was 2 opposed and 1, 2, 3, 4
In
in
favor.
favor, so the motion does pass.
What now?
Owen and
2, 3.
Owen.
Freiberger and Miles. So 4-2 is an affirmative vote, so the motion passes. And so we'll communicate to you everything that happened this afternoon, so you know that, so. Thanks.
Now, we have another agenda item, administrative items, none. Discussion about outgoing board members and transition to 2019-2020 term in September. So outgoing board members are myself and our youth member, Mr. Garcia. Want to thank you for all your comments. You made some really good questions and comments through your term.
Thank you.
Did you enter an expression of interest to be any additional term, or is this your final meeting?
I think this is my final meeting at the moment.
Okay. And Mr. Perney's term expires at the end of August, and he has not submitted an expression of interest to be reappointed, so we'll have at least one new board appointment. Everyone else carries over. This is primarily to just confirm that Mr. Perney's not extending his stay with us, and Mr. Garcia is not at this time either, but all of you are still on. The Planning Commission will have annual business meeting in September, and as will this board. So we'll have election of officers at that time and greeting of new members. But this will be the last meeting of this makeup as it relates to Mr. Perney and Mr. Garcia. But we will have a meeting in September, and we will have a business meeting, and I believe the timing would be such that we might have a new Planning Commission liaison, but Mr. Freiberger's appointment is contingent on Planning Commission, also on his willingness to continue to serve. So this could be his last meeting, or maybe not. So
Are there any candidates for the vacancy that I'm creating on the board?
I believe there were at least 2 or 3 expressions of interest that were received, and Luke, who was here at the start, was appointed in April as a youth member, but we had no meetings in May, June, or July, so this was his first opportunity to come. Okay. So we just wanted to remind everybody that everybody else's terms are continuing on, but we will meet in September to elect a chair and vice chair and to welcome a new appointment to replace Mr. Perney.
So if there is anyone else in the general public that would like to be on this board, they could get their expression of interest into the city clerk promptly.
ASAP. So that's all the business that we had. The outgoing members are not required to give speeches, but we do want to thank those who are outgoing for their attendance and their service and their contributions. So
May I now say the meeting's adjourned?
you can use the gavel for the last time.
And tap that hammer. Thank you.
Good job.
No, I have lots of them.
Did we
I think
accommodate
that's
Mr.
probably the
Sharp's
best
schedule?
gavel
Looks
we're
like we
going on
did.
here.
Barely. Perfect.
This meeting's